The fluorescent lights buzzed like wounded insects above the recovery ward at Oak Creek Memorial. Ashley Cooper's hands trembled as she reached for the 4 line on bed 4, the plastic tubing cold beneath her fingertips. 6 weeks. She'd been here 6 weeks and still couldn't shake the muscle memory, the way her body expected sirens instead of the gentle beep of cardiac monitors. The antiseptic smell was wrong. Too clean. Nothing like the copper and dust of the field hospitals in Baghdad, where the air itself tasted like survival. She steadied herself. 1 breath. Then another. Her hand stopped shaking the moment they touched the patient's arm. That was the thing nobody saw, the instantaneous shift from trembling to absolute precision. Her fingers found the radial pulse with the kind of certainty that only came from years of finding life in the dark. The patient's name was Patricia, 73, post-op gallbladder resection, and her oxygen saturation was reading perfectly at 96%. Ashley checked the foresight, the dressing, the flow rate. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. She wore her scrubs like armor and her silence like a shield. The photograph in her pocket weighed nothing and everything, her son in marine dress blues, his commanding officer recovering in bed 6 just down the hall. Colonel Marcus Cooper. She'd never spoken his name aloud to anyone on this ward. Never mentioned the connection. When she'd seen his name on the pre-op list 3 days ago, her hands had gone cold in the break room, and she'd spent 7 minutes staring at a cup of coffee that never made it to her mouth. The other nurses at Oak Creek had stopped trying to include her in their conversations by week 2. There were no happy hour invitations anymore, no whispered gossip over charting, no requests to split a lunch break. They'd noticed the way she deflected questions about her background, the way she changed the subject when anyone asked about her family, the way she seemed to be running from something rather than toward anything. What they didn't know was that she'd spent 18 years learning how to disappear into a crowd, how to be invisible, how to become the kind of person the military erased from records entirely and told never to surface. The recovery ward stretched out in pale beige walls and recessed lighting. 12 beds, 8 occupied, and the soft whoosh of ventilators creating a rhythm that felt almost like heartbeat. Ashley moved between them with a kind of quiet efficiency that made the work look effortless. She adjusted a blanket on bed 2. She recorded vitals on bed 5. She notated the intake output from a patient 3 beds down, her handwriting precise and small. Everything documented. Everything correct. Everything invisible. Dr. Sterling first noticed her during morning rounds on a Tuesday. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of expensive watch that announced itself before he did, a Rolex Submariner, probably 42 millimeters, the kind of timepiece that cost what Ashley made in a month. He moved through the recovery ward like a man accustomed to having space clear before him. The residents trailed behind him in their pressed white coats, and the attending nurses clustered near the front desk, maintaining the hierarchy that made institutions like hospitals feel like kingdoms with their own rigid feudal structures. Ashley was checking Colonel Cooper's post-op vitals when Sterling entered the bay. Blood pressure 118/76. Heart rate 84. Oxygen saturation 97% on 2 liters of nasal cannula. Everything stable. Everything exactly as it should be. She didn't look up from her work. She could feel Sterling's presence the way you feel a storm coming, a change in the air pressure, a weight descending. "Vitals, please," Sterling said to her, not asked. He was standing 4 feet away, close enough that she could smell the cologne, something expensive, something that reeked of confidence. Ashley listed them without hesitation. Her voice was calm, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd worked 100 rounds before and would work 100 more. She kept her eyes on the cardiac monitor as she spoke, her fingers steady as they adjusted the 4 line. The trembling was gone completely now. This was the transformation, the moment she became something other than the woman who'd walked through the hospital doors 6 weeks ago with her son's photograph and a military haircut she'd finally let grow out just enough to look civilian. "Very good," Sterling said, and there was something in his tone that made the residents shift their weight. He was still watching her. She could feel it the way soldiers feel the moment before an ambush, that acute, animal awareness that comes from knowing how to read danger. "Medication reconciliation?" All current, Ashley said. No interactions. Chart is up to date. What she didn't say was that she'd spent 15 minutes that morning reviewing Colonel Cooper's medication list and catching an error, a dosage that would have been catastrophic if it had made it to pharmacy. The attending physician, a man named Dr. Reeves who'd been pulling doubles for 6 days straight, had accidentally written the antibiotic dose in grams instead of milligrams. Ashley had caught it at the point-of-care system, flagged it, and corrected it without making a fuss. Without drawing attention. That was the way you survived in institutions. You fixed problems invisibly and let other people take the credit. Sterling moved on. That was that. No acknowledgement. No thank you. The rounds continued down the ward, and Ashley returned to her charting. But something had shifted. She'd done her job exactly as it was supposed to be done, caught a potentially lethal error, provided accurate information, maintained the patient's safety. That kind of competence was supposed to be invisible. Except Sterling had noticed. The thing about men who'd spent 15 years building hierarchies was that they could smell a threat to those hierarchies the way predators smell blood. Ashley's quiet competence, the way she moved through the ward without drawing attention, the way she caught things other people missed, the way she seemed to operate on a different frequency entirely, it was wrong. It disrupted the careful order of things. In Sterling's kingdom, knowledge flowed down from doctors to nurses to techs. Information moved in one direction, and authority flowed in another. A nurse who caught mistakes wasn't being helpful. She was being insubordinate. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The words came late that afternoon, around 4 o'clock, when the shift was starting its gradual transition from chaos to something almost manageable. Ashley was restocking the supply cart near the main station, saline flushes, sterile gauze, alcohol wipes, the small consumables that nobody thought about until they were needed. Sterling appeared on the other side of the cart like he'd materialized from nowhere. His presence made the fluorescent lights seem brighter, louder somehow, though that didn't make physical sense. "Ms. Cooper, we need to talk about your performance," he said. The way he said her name made it clear that he didn't actually think of her as having one. She was just Cooper. Just another body in scrubs, just another problem in his perfectly ordered ward. Ashley set down the box of tubing slowly, her movements precise and controlled. She turned to face him. He was close enough now that she could see the small capillaries in his eyes, the signs of someone who drank too much wine at dinners where important people made decisions about other people's lives. "Of course, Doctor," Ashley said. Her voice was soft, deferential, exactly what he expected. The trembling in her hands was gone completely now, replaced by something else, something cold and still. But Sterling wouldn't see that. All he saw was a timid nurse who knew her place. "The residents have mentioned that you seem to question clinical decisions," he continued. His jaw was tight. "That's not your role here. You're supposed to execute protocols, not critique them. This is your 6th week, and I think you need to understand how things work at Oak Creek Memorial." The recovery ward around them went about its business. Cardiac monitors beeped their steady rhythm. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. 2 nurses at the far end of the ward were laughing about something, probably nothing, probably just the kind of laughter that came from knowing you belonged. Ashley had heard that kind of laughter before, in places where people felt safe. "Yes, Doctor," she said. Understood. What she meant was that she understood perfectly. She understood that Sterling had seen her catch the medication error and perceived it as a threat. She understood that what looked like helpfulness from below looked like ambition from above, and ambition was only tolerated in people who acknowledged the hierarchy. She understood that the next 6 weeks would be about proving she was broken in a way that satisfied him, compliant, invisible, small. She didn't understand yet that Sterling had just made a decision that would cost him everything. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The train never saw it coming. Neither did Ashley. She'd picked up her lunch from the cafeteria line at 12:17 p.m., a habit from military life: always note the time, always know where your exits are. Chicken salad on wheat, black coffee, a protein bar she wouldn't eat because protein bars tasted like compressed cardboard. She threaded between tables in the physician's section, nodding at residents she barely knew, when Dr. Sterling stood without warning. His elbow caught the edge of her tray with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed it in his mind a dozen times. The crash came like a gunshot muffled underwater. Soup splattered across tan tile. Coffee spread in a dark mirror. The sandwich tumbled, letters scattering like confetti at a funeral nobody wanted to attend. The cafeteria didn't go silent. That was the cruelest part. Conversations continued. No one looked. No one helped. Dr. Sterling stepped over the mess without breaking stride, his Italian loafer skirting the puddle as if it were a routine obstacle. Ashley knelt on the tile floor, her scrubs pressing into dampness, pulling napkins from the dispenser with both hands. Her fingers didn't shake. Her breathing didn't quicken. She cleaned methodically, the way you clean up anything else, a spill, a failure, the wreckage of a previous life you're no longer allowed to claim. Pain is data. That's what they taught you at SEAL school. This wasn't pain. It was information. This was a man making a calculation. She threw the soaked napkins in the trash and moved back to work. The post-op chart for Colonel Marcus Cooper sat at the nurse's station when Ashley arrived for afternoon rounds. She knew that name the way you know the sound of incoming fire, not from panic, but from recognition. Marcus Cooper had been her commanding officer's commanding officer during the extraction in Baghdad. She'd pulled him out of a collapsed building once, her hands under his arms, dragging him through rubble while rounds cracked overhead. She'd never told him her name. He'd never asked. Now his chart sat in front of her with Dr. Sterling's handwriting crawling across the antibiotic section like the tracks of something that had died in the margins. Ceftriaxone, 2 grams for every 12 hours. She read it twice. The patient's temperature was 38.4 degrees Celsius. His white cell count had spiked from 8,200 to 14,900 in 6 hours. His lactate was 3.2. Early sepsis didn't announce itself with trumpets. It whispered. It crept. It killed people who ignored it. Ashley pulled up the lab results on the computer terminal, her eye scanning the chemistry panel. The dosage was wrong. Dangerously wrong. Ceftriaxone at that dose wouldn't touch what was building in Colonel Cooper's bloodstream. She needed to flag this before rounds, before the attending physicians made their pronouncements and moved on to the next patient. She needed to do it right. Dr. Sterling stood at the foot of Colonel Cooper's bed during morning rounds, his white coat starched so aggressively it could have cut glass. 12 staff members circled him like satellites. Ashley pulled the chart from the rack and stepped forward. Doctor, the sepsis protocol for this patient, the ceftriaxone dosage may need adjustment. His lactate is elevated and his WBC has doubled in 6 hours. The standard protocol would be 2 grams every 8 hours, not every 12. The words were correct. The tone was respectful. The information was vital. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. His face cycled through red to something deeper, something that looked like what happens when you compress fury into a space too small to hold it. He didn't respond. He turned to her, reached out, and threw the binder against the floor like it was something that had personally betrayed him. Charts exploded across the tile. Patient histories scattered. One page skidded all the way to the oxygen tank. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the residents to hear. Loud enough for the nursing students to remember this moment for years. The room didn't go silent. That was the second cruelest part. People found things to do. They adjusted for rates. They checked monitors. They became invisible, all of them, in the way that people do when they're witnessing something they can't afford to acknowledge. Ashley bent down. One tear escaped. Just one. It tracked down her cheek like it had been given permission to come loose. She let it fall and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Dr. Sterling. Her hands moved as they always moved, steady, precise, the muscle memory of someone who'd spent 18 years in situations where trembling meant dying. She gathered the charts. She organized them by patient name. She straightened the stack and held it against her chest. Then she looked directly at him, and her voice came out in a register that seemed to come from a different person entirely. It was calm in the way that deep water is calm, still only because the force beneath it is too overwhelming to disturb the surface. That patient is Colonel Marcus Cooper, my son's commanding officer, and your dosage will kill him by morning. The recovery ward didn't breathe. The monitors kept their rhythmic beeping. The ventilators continued their mechanical wheeze. But something in the air pressure changed, the way it changes in the moment before lightning strikes. Dr. Sterling's jaw worked silently. His eyes narrowed to something that looked less like anger and more like the moment a predator realizes it's miscalculated its prey. "My office," he said. "Now." Ashley followed him down the hallway. Every staff member they passed found a reason to look at their shoes. The door to his office was walnut, expensive, the kind of door that separated people who made decisions from people who followed them. He closed it behind her and sat at his desk, not in the chair beside it, but across from her, establishing the distance, the hierarchy, the order of things. "You don't question my clinical judgment," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Not in front of residents. Not in front of attendings. Not ever." Ashley didn't sit. She stood with the chart still in her hands. "You came here 6 weeks ago with references that barely qualify as references. Your previous employers gave you adequate, not excellent. There's a gap in your employment history, 16 months unaccounted for. You've been correcting senior physicians. You've been questioning protocols. You've been establishing yourself as something you're not." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I've been in medicine for 23 years. I've trained more residents than you've had lunch breaks. I don't need a nurse from nowhere to verify my clinical competence." He didn't raise his voice. That was what made it worse. The quietness of it. The precision. "I'm flagging your performance review for insubordination. I'm requesting an outside investigator to verify your credentials. I'm calling your previous employers personally. And if I find even one inconsistency, one gap, one discrepancy, one thing that doesn't line up, you'll be escorted out of this hospital before you can check your email." Ashley set the chart on his desk. "The dosage is wrong, Dr. Sterling. Get out of my office." She walked back to the recovery ward. Her hands didn't shake as she adjusted Colonel Cooper's as she checked his oxygen saturation, as she wrote her notes in the chart. Pain is data. Fear is data. Humiliation is data. You catalog it. You catalog everything. That's how you survive. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived in her mailbox at home. Department of Human Resources. Outside investigator. Credential verification. A request to bring all employment documentation to a meeting scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. The letter was printed on hospital letterhead, official and austere, the kind of letter that marks a beginning of something ending. She sat at her kitchen table and read it twice. Tuesday night at Oak Creek Memorial moved like all the others, fluorescent lights humming their endless monotone, monitors beeping in algorithmic rhythm, the smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, something like copper and fear that never quite washed out of the walls. Ashley was in the recovery ward at 11:06 p.m. when Colonel Marcus Cooper's oxygen saturation alarm screamed. Not beeped. Screamed. She was 2 doors down, updating a post-operative chart, when the sound cut through the ward like a blade. Her head came up. Her hand stilled. Around her, night shift nurses glanced toward the sound, hesitated, then returned to their tasks. Alarms happened. Alarms were managed. But Ashley was already moving. She didn't run. She walked. Same pace she always used, measured and precise, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that could happen. But her eyes were locked on the room ahead, cataloging what she would find before she found it. Colonel Cooper's chest was rising asymmetrically. Right side barely moving. His neck veins bulged like rope. His trachea was shifting left, she could see the deviation even in the dim light of the monitor. The ventilator was pushing air into his lungs, but the air had nowhere to go. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space between his lungs and his ribs, collapsing his right lung, crushing his heart, his life measured in minutes. His oxygen saturation read 78 and falling. The on-call physician was being paged. Sarah Chen, the night shift intern, was on her way. They would arrive in maybe 20 minutes. Colonel Cooper would be dead in 10. Ashley's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory took over, 23 years of hands that knew what to do when seconds became the difference between life and expiration. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle, prepped the site with chlorhexidine swab, alcohol, iodine. Her movements were economical, practiced, the kind of precision that comes from having done this under fire in a building that was collapsing around her. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She angled the needle carefully, feeling for the anatomical landmark, the space between the ribs where air would rush out like a confession. Dr. Sterling had added a new policy revision 2 days earlier. Nurses prohibited from performing invasive procedures without physician supervision. He'd made the announcement during rounds, watching her face to see if she understood what he was really saying. You don't belong here. She pushed the needle in. The hiss of air escaping was like a pressure valve releasing. Like something trapped and furious finally breaking free. The oxygen saturation monitor caught it a half second after her ears did. 78, then 82. Then 88. Then climbing steady into the safe zone while Colonel Cooper's breathing began to normalize, his chest rising symmetrically now, both sides moving in parallel, the silent language of adequate perfusion. 94%. Stable. She'd saved his life in 90 seconds using a needle and her hands and nothing else but the memory of a night in Baghdad when she'd done the same thing for a man she didn't know in a building that was burning. The on-call physician arrived 10 minutes later, taking in the scene, the needle positioned perfectly, the monitoring equipment documenting the intervention, Ashley standing beside the bed with her hand steady and her face composed like she'd done nothing more remarkable than check the 4-rate. He opened his mouth to ask what had happened, but he was still a resident, and he could read the clinical picture well enough. The patient was stable. His O2 was climbing. His vital signs were normalizing. You performed the decompression, he asked quietly. Tension pneumothorax, Ashley said. He was hypoxic. He was dying. She said it like she was commenting on the weather. That was her real power, she understood then, not the training or the muscle memory or the hands that remembered things her conscious mind had tried to forget. It was the ability to stay calm in the space between life and death, to move through catastrophe like it was just another Tuesday, like she wasn't burning from the inside with things she couldn't say. The resident nodded. He looked at Colonel Cooper's stabilizing numbers. He looked at Ashley's face. He said, "You probably just saved his life." She didn't respond. Just checked the catheter placement one more time, the way someone might touch a tattoo to make sure it was still there, and turned to walk out. That was when Dr. Sterling came through the doors. He took in the scene in one sweep, the needle, the patient, Ashley's calm departure, and his entire body went rigid. His face didn't change. That was worse than anger would have been. His face simply went cold, the way a shark's eyes go flat when it recognizes prey. He didn't say anything to Ashley. He walked straight to the resident, looked down at the chart, and his jaw worked like he was tasting something poisonous. Then he pulled his phone out before the resident had even finished explaining. He called Chief of Staff Dr. Morrison at home. It was nearly midnight, but Sterling had Morrison's number, and Morrison answered like a man who'd learned to jump whenever Sterling called. "We have a credentialing issue," Sterling said. His voice was quiet. Clinical. A nurse just performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a patient. Needle decompression. No physician present. I need an immediate investigation into her credentials. He hung up without waiting for the answer. He was already dialing again, and this time Ashley heard her name from 3 rooms away. He was calling her previous employers, the ones whose references had gone carefully silent when his first round of inquiries came through. Now he was calling them with new urgency. Now he was saying words like potential fraud, credential misrepresentation, state medical board, and the weight of those words was like watching dominoes fall in real time, each one calculated to land before the last one finished tipping. By 6 in the morning, hospital security was at her locker. Not unfriendly, just professional. Just doing their job. They escorted her from Oak Creek Memorial in front of everyone, the day shift arriving, the night shift finishing up, everyone seeing the nurse in the unit patch and the security guards and understanding immediately what that meant. Administrative leave, they said. Pending investigation. The letter was waiting at her apartment, printed on hospital letterhead. Official. Austere. The kind of document that marks the beginning of something ending, except it wasn't ending, it was erasing. She'd saved a life 3 hours ago, and now she was suspended from the place she'd been hiding in for 6 weeks. Her past was catching up with her like a shadow that had finally learned to move faster than the sun, and she was running out of places to stand where the darkness couldn't reach. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Sterling's hands moved with surgical precision as he dialed the Chief of Staff's home number at 11:53 p.m. 3 rings. The voice on the other end was groggy, annoyed, then suddenly alert when Sterling identified himself. "We have a credentialing issue," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "A nurse on my service performed an unauthorized procedure. Tension pneumothorax decompression. No physician present. She could have killed that patient." The lie sat between them like a surgical instrument, was sharp, purposeful, and lethal. The Chief of Staff listened. Sterling mentioned board member Harrison's name. Then Bennett's. Then Conrad's. He invoked 3 decades of professional favors, each one a thread in the network he'd spent 15 years weaving. "I'm filing a formal complaint tomorrow morning," Sterling continued. "But I wanted you to hear this first, before the paperwork hits your desk. We need to protect the hospital." By midnight, the investigation machinery was already grinding. The next call came at 6:15 a.m. Sterling's voice was different now, concerned, measured, the tone of a senior physician protecting the profession. He reached Ashley's 3 references, each one listed in her employment file. "I'm calling about Ashley Cooper. She's been wonderful with our patients, but we've discovered some inconsistencies in her credentials. Can you confirm her military nursing experience?" The first reference, a retired Army captain in Beaumont, hesitated. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Sterling didn't answer directly. "We're just verifying. For quality assurance." By the time he'd finished the third call, doubt had been planted like a seed in soil that didn't need much water to grow into something poisonous. At 7:33 a.m., an outside investigator arrived at Oak Creek Memorial. His name was Richardson. 62 years old, former FBI, the kind of man who carried the scent of bureaucratic authority like cologne. He spent for hours reviewing Ashley's employment file in Sterling's office, asking questions that seemed innocent but cut in specific directions. Any gaps in her background? Any unexplained absences from previous positions? Any financial irregularities? Sterling provided carefully curated documentation, policy violations he'd flagged, performance reviews he'd downgraded, emails suggesting her competence exceeded her qualifications in ways that seemed suspicious rather than impressive. The investigator wrote everything down. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply documented the narrative Sterling was constructing, one detail at a time. At 10:42 a.m., hospital security escorted Ashley Cooper out of Oak Creek Memorial in front of her colleagues. She walked between 2 uniformed officers, her badge already removed, her locker key already surrendered. The hallway fell silent as they passed. Nurses she'd worked with for 6 weeks stared at their shoes. A patient's family member whispered something. Ashley's jaw tightened, the only visible response, and she kept walking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects that had learned to anticipate suffering. The automatic doors hissed open to the parking lot where rain had begun to fall, drumming against the concrete like a countdown that nobody wanted to hear. One of the security officers handed her a manila envelope. Administrative leave, pending investigation, he said, not meeting her eyes. You'll receive formal notification. The rain soaked through her scrubs as she stood in the parking lot alone, watching the doors close behind her. That was when the first tear came, not from fear, but from the suffocating recognition that she'd finally been forced to surface, that the invisible life she'd constructed was being dismantled by a man who saw her competence as a threat to his empire. The next morning, Ashley sat at her kitchen table at 9:41 a.m. with a termination notice in front of her. The words blurred, pending outcome of credentialing investigation, serious concerns about credentials and operational judgment, recommend immediate separation from employment, final paycheck would be mailed. Her hands didn't shake. That wasn't composure. That was shock, the specific numbness that comes when the last rope you were holding snaps in your fingers and you're already in free fall. Lance Corporal James Cooper found her there, still in the clothes she'd worn to the hospital, still holding the letter. Her son was home on unexpected emergency leave. His commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Cooper, had suffered what the hospital was calling a medical crisis that required family presence. James had texted her from the airport. She hadn't responded. Now he stood in the kitchen doorway, uniform still crisp from travel, and saw his mother the way she hadn't let him see her in 6 weeks of work, broken. "Mom." His voice cracked with the kind of fear that military training doesn't prepare you for. "Why are you home?" She couldn't find words for it. Couldn't explain that she'd once held secrets so classified they'd been erased from every database, that she'd pulled 47 people from a building collapse in Baghdad under enemy fire, that the military had ordered her to disappear, and she'd spent 15 years building a life that was supposed to be invisible, unremarkable, safe. Couldn't tell him that she'd saved Colonel Marcus Cooper's life yesterday and been fired for it this morning. Couldn't admit that somewhere inside her, underneath the composure and the training and the careful anonymity, she was terrified, not of Dr. Sterling, but of the truth finally catching up with her. James sat across from her, his Marine training warring with the fear in his eyes. She wiped her face and said only, "I did my job." It wasn't enough. The statement hung between them like a diagnosis nobody wanted to accept. James reached across the table and took her hand, but he didn't speak. Some things don't have words. Some things just require presence. Meanwhile, in Colonel Cooper's room at Oak Creek Memorial, a patient in the adjacent bed lay staring at the recovery ward door. His name was Rashid Al-Hakim, admitted 2 days earlier for emergency gallbladder surgery. He'd arrived from a private security contractor position in Kuwait, complaining of acute abdominal pain that required immediate intervention. The nurses had noted his unusual agitation during post-op recovery, his tendency to stare at the corridor, his muttering in Arabic between doses of pain medication. The night before, when Ashley had come to check his vitals, routine work, documented in his chart at 11:43 p.m., he'd gone completely still. His heart rate had spiked. His oxygen saturation had dipped. She'd increased his pain medication, adjusted his position, asked if he was having complications. He'd only stared at her face as if he was seeing a ghost made of light. By Wednesday afternoon, Rashid's agitation had escalated beyond what pain medication could manage. His heart monitor showed sustained tachycardia. His blood pressure climbed to 167/94. The nursing staff noted that he'd begun demanding something in a mixture of Arabic and broken English. The woman. The nurse. Nightingale. The ward nurses didn't understand. Rashid had no documented family visiting the hospital. His emergency contact information was redacted, classified, marked with security clearance notations that made the nursing staff uncomfortable. By Thursday morning, he was asking for her again, his voice growing more urgent, his agitation visible to every patient and family member on the ward. The charge nurse noted his condition deteriorating. An additional sedative was administered. But Rashid's heart monitor kept spiking, his body responding to something deeper than pain, something more primal than fear. What the hospital staff didn't know was that Rashid Al-Hakim had spent 15 years believing a ghost was responsible for his survival. On March 23, 2009, in the Jolan district of Fallujah, a building collapse during a classified hostage extraction had trapped him under reinforced concrete with a sucking chest wound and a severed brachial artery. He'd been bleeding out in absolute darkness when hands found him. Hands steady as surgical steel. A voice saying only, "I've got you. Stay with me." Those hands had applied a tourniquet with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. That voice had belonged to a woman with a faded unit patch inside her jacket, the insignia of the Special Forces. She'd carried him for blocks through enemy fire, her own left shoulder torn open by shrapnel, and gotten him to the field hospital with 90 seconds of blood pressure left in his body. The official report had listed her only as unidentified SEAL medic, female, call sign Nightingale, status, deceased in action. He'd grieved her for 15 years. And then he'd walked into Oak Creek Memorial for emergency surgery and seen her checking vitals on Colonel Cooper. The agitation continued through Thursday night and into Friday morning. Rashid's demands grew louder, more insistent. He was asking staff to find the nurse named Cooper. He had information about her. He had something to tell her. The nurses documented his behavior as post-operative delirium. A psychiatric consultation was ordered. More sedatives were administered. But when Ashley's name appeared in the system, when the hospital staff finally checked the patient roster and matched Cooper to the woman who'd been escorted out by security the day before, something shifted. Rashid began demanding to leave his bed. His incision site began bleeding. His heart monitor displayed the electrical signature of a man whose body was overriding every chemical attempt to keep him calm. On Friday afternoon at 2:33 p.m., during normal visiting hours, the recovery ward's back entrance door slammed open with enough force to set off a proximity alarm. A man entered, 6 feet 5 inches tall, with visible shrapnel scarring running like a topographic map across his neck and shoulders, with eyes that carried the specific exhaustion of someone who'd survived things he wasn't supposed to survive. His jacket was military-grade, weather-stained, and his voice when he spoke carried an accent layered with Baghdad dust. "Where is she?" "The woman." "Nightingale." The words came out in a mixture of English and Arabic, each one a command that his body language reinforced with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. The recovery ward imploded into chaos. A family visiting a post-operative patient pulled their child back from the doorway. A nurse reached for the code button on the nearest wall phone. 2 security guards stationed near the elevators froze for exactly 2 seconds, that specific hesitation that comes when a physical threat walks through the door wearing the kind of presence that makes air pressure change. The patient in the east bed began calling for help. The cardiac monitor in Colonel Cooper's room started alarming. Machines beeped. Someone called for security over the intercom. Another nurse moved toward the emergency call system. The instinct was universal. Mammalian, correct, run. Ashley was in the lower level, collecting the remainder of her belongings from her locker, her personal stethoscope, a photo of James in his dress uniform, a small wooden box containing things she'd collected over 6 weeks of careful anonymity. She heard the alarm bleed through the ceiling speakers. She heard the chaos translated into overhead codes and security notifications. She recognized something in the pattern of sounds, not fear, but urgency with a very specific frequency. She abandoned the box, took the back stairwell, and moved toward the recovery ward with the certainty of muscle memory that had learned to respond before conscious thought could interfere. She entered the ward from the corridor junction as staff scattered outward like water repelled from heated metal. The 6'5" man stood in the center of the room, still shouting, still searching faces, still moving with the purposeful aggression of someone looking for a specific person. Everyone else was retreating. Everyone else was following the logic of self-preservation. Ashley moved directly toward him, her hands visible, her voice steady as concrete. "Rashid." The man stopped mid-stride. His eyes locked onto her face. The recognition that crossed his features wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous, total, the kind of recognition that comes when a person who's been dead in your mind suddenly becomes alive in your body. His hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from the specific shock of 15 years collapsing into 3 seconds. He reached for his jacket and ripped it open with both hands, revealing the lining. Sewn into the interior was a faded unit patch, the same Special Forces insignia that had once been stitched into Ashley's own jackets, worn during night operations in 2009. The patch was no larger than a postage stamp, but it carried 15 years of survival and gratitude in its faded threads. Lance Corporal James Cooper, who'd been visiting his commanding officer in the adjacent room, appeared in the doorway. His uniform was dress blues, his bearing was perfect military posture, and when he saw the interaction, his hand moved instinctively to his side despite being unarmed. He assessed the situation in the way military personnel assess situations: threat matrix, distance variables, potential escalation vectors. What he saw was a woman who'd been teaching him discipline his entire life, making eye contact with a man who was clearly experiencing the profound relief of something found after 15 years of being lost. James stepped forward and said quietly but with the absolute clarity of military command, "That Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, sir." The words hung in the recovery ward like a benediction that nobody else understood. Rashid pulled his medical file from the pocket of his jacket, a document he'd been carrying for 15 years, and opened it to a specific page. His hands shook as he read the notation aloud, his voice breaking on each word: "Life saved by unidentified SEAL medic, female, call sign Nightingale, the 23rd of March, 2009. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their nervous frequency overhead, a sound most people never consciously register but that suddenly became the only sound in existence. From the hallway emerged a man in civilian clothes, weathered face, military bearing that hadn't faded despite the years, eyes that carried the weight of classified operations. His name was Commander Jackson Mills, retired Navy SEAL, and his voice when he spoke carried across the recovery ward like a radio transmission from another era: 2 silver stars for combat valor. He paused, letting the words land. 3 bronze stars with valor for actions under fire. Another pause, heavier this time. And a Navy cross she's not allowed to wear for an operation that officially never happened. Dr. Sterling, who'd arrived to check Colonel Cooper's post-operative status, had gone pale by the second sentence. By the third sentence, his hands had begun to shake. Commander Mills continued, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper pulled 47 people from a building collapse during a classified hostage extraction in Fallujah, Iraq. She stayed behind when the roof came down. Spent 6 days behind enemy lines before extraction. She was medevaced with a sucking chest wound, a severed brachial artery, and enough shrapnel embedded in her left shoulder to set off metal detectors for the rest of her life." An FBI liaison appeared from the corridor, Special Agent David Torres, with 2 federal marshals positioned behind him, their presence both official and ominous. Torres held a file folder that was at least 2 inches thick. The operation was buried under national security protocol in 2009, Torres announced, his voice carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to delivering statements that changed institutional trajectories. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper was ordered to disappear. Her military records were erased. She was given a new social security number, a new identity protocol, and explicit instructions never to surface or acknowledge her previous service. Torres opened the folder and extracted a document with security classification markings that Dr. Sterling could see from where he stood frozen. She's been operating under a legal identity protection order for 15 years. Her employment at Oak Creek Memorial should never have required a background investigation. Her credentials are, in fact, impeccable. By the 5th sentence, Dr. Sterling had become something smaller than himself, a man watching the institutional scaffolding that had protected him for 15 years begin to collapse. His mouth moved silently. His career, his connections, his carefully constructed narrative of professional superiority, all of it was being dismantled by a woman in scrubs who'd never raised her voice, never broken composure, and never once mentioned the fact that she'd saved more lives in a single night in Baghdad than Sterling had touched in his entire medical career. The fluorescent lights continued buzzing. The heart monitors continued their electronic rhythm. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of news vans pulling into the hospital parking lot became audible through the recovery ward windows, a sound like the future arriving exactly when it was supposed to. The news vans pulled into the parking lot like a military convoy. Satellite dishes rose from their roofs. Camera crews assembled on the front steps of Oak Creek Memorial. Inside the recovery ward, the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer as the heart monitors continued their electronic rhythm, steady and sure, while outside the windows the future was arriving in real time. 3 days had passed since Ashley sat broken at her kitchen table. 3 days of silence. 3 days of her son asking questions she couldn't answer. 3 days of knowing that everything she'd buried for 15 years, every commendation, every scar, every life she'd saved under fire in the streets of Baghdad, had been erased with a signature on a personnel file. The recovery ward doors exploded open at 2:11 p.m. A man who stood 6 feet 5 inches tall stormed through the entrance like a cyclone in human form. His jacket was torn at the shoulders. His chest heaved with the kind of breathing that comes from pure adrenaline. His eyes, dark as wet concrete, ringed with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent too many nights awake, scanned the ward methodically, searching for a face he hadn't seen in 15 years. His Baghdad accent cut through the air like broken glass. "Where is she? Where is Nightingale?" Every person in that recovery ward moved the same direction. Away. The resident physician backed toward the supply closet. 2 nurses retreated behind the med cart. An orderly simply walked out. The machine of civilized hospital protocol collapsed in seconds, replaced by pure survival instinct. This man radiated the kind of controlled fury that only comes from military training combined with desperate need. Only one person moved toward him. Ashley stepped out from behind the nurse's station, her scrubs the color of seafoam, her hair pulled back the way she wore it during all her night shifts in Baghdad. She walked directly toward the intruder with recognition blooming across her face like sunrise breaking through clouds, the kind of recognition that lives in muscle memory and haunts quiet mornings. It was Rashid al-Hakim. Or what remained of Rashid al-Hakim after 15 years and 3 additional tours and what looked like shrapnel embedded in the flesh above his left clavicle and the weight of survival that sits on men who were never supposed to make it home. He stopped mid-stride. His breath caught. His hands opened and closed in fists as he stared at Ashley's face, and for exactly 3 seconds neither of them moved. Then Rashid ripped open his jacket with the kind of violence you reserve for truth-telling. His shirt tore. His chest was a geography of scars, white lines crossing brown skin like roads on a war map. And sewn inside the lining of his jacket was the faded Special Forces unit patch. The same insignia. The same desert tan eagle with its wings spread wide. The same patch that Ashley had worn the night she descended into a collapsed building in Jolan district under enemy fire, felt the concrete crumbling around her like a dying heartbeat, and pulled Rashid from beneath 3 tons of rubble with her own hands bleeding and her oxygen mask half shattered and only one thought in her mind, "Not on my watch, not today, not this one." "Nightingale," he said. His voice shook like an idling diesel engine. "You came back. You finally came back." James Cooper stood at the recovery ward door, positioned as he'd been stationed that morning, Marine dress uniform pressed to razor perfection, dress blue so dark they looked black in the fluorescent light. His son. Her son. He stepped forward and spoke with the precision of military bearing, "That Senior Chief Petty Officer Cooper, sir. Rashid. That's her actual name. She's been here the whole time." Rashid pulled his own medical file from the counter with trembling hands. The same hands that had been broken once by an IED blast and reset 3 times. He found the notation handwritten in the margin from the field hospital in Baghdad, dated 2009, in Dr. Jameson's cramped handwriting, "Life saved by unidentified SEAL medic, female, call sign Nightingale. Condition stable. Patient owes his life to her field work." He read it aloud. Twice. Like the words might change if he said them with the right intonation. The recovery ward had gone dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the rain starting outside, where you can hear someone's heartbeat in your own chest, where the world narrows down to one moment that contains all the moments before it. The hallway doors opened again. This time a man in navy dress whites emerged, his uniform so crisp it looked like it could cut glass. Commander Mills. Beside him walked a woman in a dark suit with an FBI credential hanging from her neck. Agent Torres. Behind them, 2 federal marshals in tactical gear. Commander Mills walked to the center of the recovery ward, and his voice carried across every monitor, every beeping machine, every held breath. Ashley Cooper served as a senior chief petty officer in Naval Special Warfare Command. 2 silver stars. He paused. The words landed like thunder. 3 bronze stars with valor. Another pause. The hospital administrator's face had gone the color of old plaster. And a Navy cross she's not allowed to wear. The silence didn't just fill the room. It occupied it like a second heartbeat. That was when Dr. Sterling arrived. He had been in his office on the 3rd floor when his phone began ringing. The calls came in rapid succession. The hospital attorney. The board chair. The chief of staff. Each message shorter than the last. Each message containing words he'd never heard directed at himself: suspension. Investigation. Federal marshals. The last call simply said, "Don't leave your office." He didn't leave his office. He rode the elevator down instead. He emerged through the recovery ward doors, and the color drained from his face in stages, red to pale to something that looked like old concrete. His eyes found Ashley first. Then found Rashid. Then found the Special Forces patch. His mouth opened and closed like a fish removed from water, searching for oxygen that wouldn't come. Agent Torres stepped forward, her identification already raised. She was speaking to someone on her radio, but her eyes never left Dr. Sterling. "Yes, he's here. In the recovery ward. Board Chair Cross, I'm going to need you and the hospital legal team in the main lobby in 30 minutes. We're going to need news cameras for this one." The fluorescent lights hummed like they always hummed, but the sound seemed different now, sharper, more aware, more present. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth again. Nothing came out except air. "You're terminated," Agent Torres said. Not as a question. As a statement of fact. Your medical license is under federal suspension pending investigation into harassment of a decorated combat veteran, fabrication of performance reviews, and retaliation against a nurse who saved a patient's life in direct violation of federal whistleblower protection laws. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say will be noted in the investigation file. The board assembled in the main lobby at exactly 4 p.m. News cameras were in position by 3:55. The statement was prepared, and it was surgical: gross violations of hospital ethics, falsification of records, systematic harassment of a protected whistleblower, retaliation against a veteran, abuse of institutional authority. Board Chair William Cross read it with the kind of precision that only comes from legal review and moral certainty. Dr. Sterling stood there while the cameras rolled. He stood there as his former colleagues emerged from various corridors and watched. He stood there as his face cycled through colors, red to white to gray to something that looked like old ash. His hands shook. His breathing became shallow. The man who had spent 15 years constructing a hierarchy of power, who had climbed the ladder on the backs of residents he'd humiliated and nurses he'd dismissed, who had believed himself untouchable because he'd cultivated the right allies and the right connections, that man simply collapsed inward, like a building coming down in controlled demolition. The video went viral within 3 hours. 2.3 million views by the following morning. The medical community fractured along clean lines. Some said he deserved worse, others said the hospital should have moved faster, most simply said nothing and deleted his contact information from their phones. His office was emptied by nightfall. His parking space was reassigned to Dr. Patricia Hendricks by dawn. His calls went unanswered. The people who had owed him favor suddenly had other obligations, other loyalties, other reasons to be unavailable. The board opened a formal investigation. The State Medical Board launched its own review. 2 residents came forward with stories of his abuse, public humiliation, thrown instruments, systematic intimidation. The stories multiplied like cells dividing, each one identical in its pattern, each one a testament to a man who had built his entire career on the terror of people beneath him. 6 months later, someone spotted him teaching CPR basics at a community college gymnasium. The gymnasium was the kind with fluorescent lights that hummed worse than hospital lights, with plastic mats that smelled like every gym floor that had ever existed, with a class of 22 students, most of whom had no idea they were learning chest compressions from a man who'd once been chief of surgery at one of Houston's premier hospitals. He was demonstrating the head tilt chin lift maneuver on a plastic dummy when a former resident walked past the gymnasium windows. The former resident didn't stop. Just kept walking. Dr. Sterling was teaching CPR for $15 an hour. His medical license was suspended pending federal review. His hand shook when he pressed down on the dummy's chest. His voice had lost its authority. He was simply a man in a gymnasium, trying to remain employed, trying to remain relevant, trying to remain anything at all. But that wasn't the final image. The final image was from that same evening, Dr. Sterling leaving the community college in a 12-year-old sedan, alone, while across Houston, his former colleagues attended the hospital gala honoring Ashley Cooper. Back in the recovery ward of Oak Creek Memorial, Ashley stood in her scrubs as the night shift began. The faded Special Forces unit patch had been removed from Rashid's jacket, carefully pressed, and framed on the wall behind the nurse's station. A small plaque beneath it read, "In honor of Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, USN, Ret, call sign, Nightingale." She checked Colonel Marcus Cooper's vitals with the precision that comes from 1,000 nights of combat medicine. His oxygen saturation was 98%. His breathing was steady and strong. The tension pneumothorax was resolved. The crisis that had started 15 years ago in Baghdad was, finally, healing. James stood beside the bed in his marine dress uniform. His posture was straight. His eyes were proud. His mother worked, and he watched her work, and everything about the moment felt like homecoming. Rashid al-Hakim visited one final time before his discharge, pressed his hand to his heart in the old gesture of respect, and bowed deeply to Ashley. No words needed. 15 years of debt was being repaid not in money or medals or recognition, but in the simple fact that she was finally standing in the light where she belonged. Commander Mills presented her with a shadow box containing the decoration she'd never been allowed to display. The silver stars caught the light like stars themselves. The bronze stars with their ribbon bars spoke of the moments nobody would ever fully know. And the Navy Cross, the one she'd hidden her entire life, sat in the center position like a question finally answered. The hospital offered her a promotion to clinical supervisor. The board of directors issued a formal apology. She accepted both with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout everything. As she walked through the recovery ward at shift change, nurses and residents nodded with genuine respect. The antiseptic smell still filled the air. The monitors still beeped their electronic rhythm. But Ashley no longer kept her head down. She'd spent 15 years disappeared by the government she'd served. One vindictive doctor had tried to erase her again. But some things can't be buried forever. Some things have a way of surfacing, of being recognized, of finding their way home. She adjusted her stethoscope and the unit patch was visible behind her on the wall, proof that heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed, if you've ever known someone whose quiet strength was their greatest weapon, subscribe and let us know your story. The comments are open. The platform is yours.